You're listening to Indiana Jones and the Comics Crusade on the LONGBOX CRUSADE NETWORK. Hello and welcome to Indiana Jones and the Comics Crusade. I'm your host, Jared Albrecht, the Yard Sale Artist, and I will be taking you on an adventure with me as I index all 34 issues of 1983's The Further Adventures of Indiana Jones by Marvel Comics. On this episode, we'll be taking a look at issue number 8. Issue 8 was cover dated August 1983. The script is by David Michelinie, penciler is Kerry Gamble, inker is Sam De La Rosa, letterer is Janice Shang, colorist is Paul Becton, and the editor is Louise Jones. Here's the cover description for issue number 8. This cover is drawn by Howard Chaykin and inked by Terry Austin. The Marvel Comics Group banner is light blue with black letters, and Indiana Jones stands pistol ready in his light blue corner box. The title logo is yellow with red highlights, and the main action depicts Indiana Jones front and center with Marion by his side, both of them brandishing pistols. They appear to be cornered by an unseen native force. We can only see the tips of their spears coming into frame from all angles. And our heroic duo is backed up against stacks of bones that have been formed in the shape of a giant menacing skull. And now for a quick story synopsis. When we last saw Indiana Jones, he and Marion were hiding from Nazis in a cave deep in the African jungle. Unfortunately, they ended up sharing the cave with an angry panther. Forced to reveal their position, and with a little help from the panther, our duo manages to evade the Nazis long enough to run into a member of the Shintai tribe, descendants of Atlantis, exactly what they were searching for. What they didn't expect was for the Shintai warrior to be 8 feet tall and immediately killed by one of the Nazis. The rest of the tribe emerges from the jungle and captures all the Nazis, their guide and rival to Indy MacGyver, and Indy and Marion. Turns out the Atlantean descendants aren't even the cool, interesting Atlanteans, but instead, they're the outcast death worshippers, and they don't recognize political allegiances, so all the prisoners are lumped together and put into a death trap. Indiana Jones uses some quick thinking and escapes the trap, along with MacGyver and the Nazi leader, but the Nazi is hellbent on stealing an Atlantean power crystal, which ends up being more power than he can handle, and he destroys the entire settlement, killing everyone with the exception of Indy, Marion, and the wily MacGyver. Okay, folks, welcome back to the Temple of Longbox, buried deep beneath the sub-basement of LONGBOX CRUSADE headquarters. I would like to welcome our special guest. It is friend of the show and one of my co-hosts over on Aaron Moss's G.I. Joe Real American Headcast podcast. It is author extraordinaire and all-around nice guy, Brad Abraham. Welcome to the Temple of Longbox, Brad.
Jared, it is great to be here. I deciphered the clues. I dodged the booby traps. I tricked my Peruvian guide into setting off the spike trap. And nice. I am here and ready to talk about one of my all-time favorite fictional characters.
Oh, man, we got the right guy here for this episode.
You do.
So here we are, Further Adventures of Indiana Jones number 8. I did not prepare you for the initial question that I ask all the guests. You are unprepared. You are on the spot, although I get almost exclusively the same answer every time. How did you come to Indiana Jones? Everyone says Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then how did you come to this comic, Marvel's Further Adventures?
The short answer is Raiders of the Lost Ark. I was, 8 years old when it hit theaters. I was not there opening week or opening season. My parents actually saw it before I did. They went on a couple's double date for dinner and a movie to see Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they both came back just absolutely raving about it. Top to bottom, start to finish, raving about it. And they said, we're going to take you to see this movie. You're going to love it. And I was all pumped to see it. I don't think I saw it until the fall because I remember talking to some kids at school. Oh, yeah, my parents are going to go take me to see Raiders of the Lost Ark. They say it's really great. And you could sort of see the color drain from a lot of these kids' faces. And they're like, no, it's really scary. I'm like, what? And he's like, it's really scary. There's skeletons jumping out of everywhere. some guy's face melts, another guy's head explodes, a dude gets chopped up by a airplane propeller. It's just really scary. There's snakes everywhere. And so, the color kind of drained from my face. And I'm like, oh man, is this going to be one of those things? Because you wouldn't know it now, but I was a very skittish child back then. Any kind of mildly scary thing on TV would give me innumerable nightmares, like Scooby-Doo, Where Are You, The Ghosts, the Minor 49er, and those nightmares. So I went from being all amped up, like on a 9 or 10 level scale to say, Raiders of the Lost Ark, to like a 2 or a 3. But, I tried to put on a good face and a good front for it. And my parents took me. We sat down in the theater and the lights dimmed. And after about the first 5 minutes, I'm like, okay, I'm going to be all right. Yes, there's some jolts. Yes, there's some jumps. There's Forrestal all staked, sliding out and right into the camera and everything. But I just kind of got on the wavelength of it really, really quickly. And I think for me, when you talk about 80s pop culture, 80s media fueled obsessions, it was Star Wars, then G.I. Joe, and Indiana Jones is kind of the summit of the pyramid because he's just that perfect combination of interests for me. You got action adventure, you got the supernatural, you got archaeology and exploration of the natural world, and you get that 1930s pulp storytelling. There's Nazis, there's evil industrialists, there's evil cults, there's mystery. And I think if you were like me, born in the early 1970s and heading into the 1980s, a lot of this media was still out there. I remember watching old Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon serials on TV. They'd run them Saturday morning when we lived in Vancouver, and a lot of them were picking up from last week's episode and heading, straight into this one. So I was kind of used to that language of the cliffhanger and picking up mid-action, which Indiana Jones in the movies and in this comic book really captured. So that's kind of how I came to Indiana Jones through the movie. But the comic, I think the first issue of the comic I ever picked up was issue 4. It had that great cover of Indy in the subway tunnel, kind of whipping at the bad guys while the girl behind him is looking over her shoulder and seeing a train barreling towards them, which is kind of like the typical Indiana Jones scenario where he seems to be in control on one end and all this stuff's kind of falling apart and going crazy behind him, and he was never the suave James Bond type. He was more the guy who survives out of some skill, but out of just dumb luck. So I kind of empathize with him in the situation. He was cool, but he wasn't super slick cool. And I picked it up off the spinner rack and I flipped through it and I went, okay, this is great. I'm going to, instead of buying a candy bar or a little bag of Hostess potato chips, because this is in Canada, I just bought the comic and I read it. And I picked up the next issue and I read that. And I came to it kind of sporadically over the years. It was never one I really collected because I wasn't huge into comics at the time. It wasn't until a year or so later that I started getting into the G.I. Joe comic. In the years since, anytime I'd visit a random comic book shop, I always have a loyalty to my local store, but anytime I go into a comic book shop, I'd like to pick up something just so I'm leaving some money on the table. And it became one of those go-to books where I would be guaranteed to walk out with something. And I just asked the guy behind the counter, do you have any of the Marvel Indiana Jones books? And they usually had some of them. And I'd go through and usually there were ones I didn't have, and I just grab them all and buy them. So I do own a complete run of the individual issues of the further adventures, plus the single issue adaptations of the 3 movies that were released in the 80s. We won't go into the 4th and the 5th one. Different era, different world. And a whole other conversation. But that was it. And I only just recently completed the collection. And then I had some help from my local comic book guy, the Outer Limits comic shop up in Waltham, who sold me a bunch of back issues and dug some others out of storage for me. So that's my comic book adventure with Indy.
Well, I like it. And it sounds to me like you might have had some really good timing, because I've noticed that I got the full run as well, and it wasn't very expensive to get. But I've noticed as of the last couple of years, especially wandering around Heroes Con, looking at the pricing of the further adventures of Indiana Jones, they are going up.
You know what? This is a little bit of indie related trivia, which you were probably aware of. Back in 2008, when Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was being released, there was this huge merchandising push of indie stuff. All of a sudden, there were new toys, there were games, there was all sorts of stuff. But I think it was Dark Horse published this omnibus series, collecting 3 volumes, collecting the Marvel books. And I know this because I'd read them. I'd borrowed them from the library and read them because I was still collecting the individual issues at the time and really enjoyed them. And I was looking to think, okay, well, maybe I'll just go buy these omnibus books. And the first one and the third one are relatively easy to get your hands on, but it's the second one, which is just super, super ridiculously expensive for some reason, whether there was a short run of them, I don't know. It ended up being more cost effective to buy the individual issues, to hunt those down, rather than buying an omnibus collection. So
yeah, those omnibus are still pretty pricey to this day.
Yeah. And I think, I'm not sure why the prices have gone up. I think mainly because it's just a limited resource, that they're not being reprinted. I expected them to do a big reprint when the most recent film came out, but both Marvel and Disney kind of abandoned it. They didn't really do a big merchandising push. There's not even a novelization of most recent film, which is disappointing to me, a novelization collector, because I have all the indie novelizations and I have all the Bantam Del Rey indie books that were published in the 90s. But there's this one lacking area, is the Dial of Destiny not getting a novelization. So that's unfortunate.
Well, let's get into the further adventures of Indiana Jones number 8. And we'll start where we start with all comics. We'll start with the cover. I'm going to put my cards on the table early and say I particularly enjoy this cover, but I'm interested in your thoughts, Brad. What do you think of this cover as I previously described?
I love this cover. I think if I saw this one on a spinner rack back in the day, which I did not in this case, I would have grabbed it right away. It's an attention grabber, and I think the best metric for its success is it looks and feels like Indiana Jones. Here, he's facing off against some unseen enemies. I guess it's Marion beside him, even though I did not know when I first saw the comic cover that Marion was in this one. Because I think when I was collecting them, I got this one before I got issue 7. I kind of collected them out of order, but it just has all the tropes. It's got him with his gun and steely determination. Looks like arrows flying at him, and he's standing before a massive skull that appears to be made of other skeletal remains, big bones and everything, holding it up. And it's just, sometimes with the cover, you don't know if this is accurate or if it's just representative of, or just interpretive of what happens in the book. But so far, looking at all the covers of this book, all of them have fallen into the depiction. So surprises here. There are a lot of big skulls and bone work and arrows flying, temples and everything there. So, and I like the use of yellow in Indiana Jones. It just kind of leaps out onto, it really leaps out from you. And of course it says featuring the hero of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But really, if you were a kid in the 80s, you knew who that guy was. If Adventure had a name, it must be Indiana Jones. So it's an excellent cover. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I do love how, especially these comics, especially these earlier ones, I don't know how long they keep this gig up, but that little blurb appears on a lot of these early issues featuring the hero of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
Because as I remind everybody on every episode, there was just the one movie to go from at this point. Although I always find something, almost always, and I did find something in this one too, that is sort of a touchstone that will be used later on in the series of Indiana Jones movies. It's weird how many things I find in these comics that will eventually appear in Indiana Jones movies, but those movies don't exist at the time of printing. But yes, they have the Raiders of the Lost Ark stamp on there as if to say, it's that Indiana Jones guy. This was before they retitled that movie, for home video release, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So it's a weird snapshot in time when people kind of almost needed to be reminded that, hey, this is the guy from Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that time, I'm not even sure if we knew there was a sequel coming.
I don't think we did.
It's weird because if you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark, it kind of very much feels like a one and done in its own way, same as the first Star Wars has like a nice closed circular journey. Everybody gets an arc, everybody gets a payoff. I mean, we assumed at this point in the 80s that if a movie was really successful, like as successful as Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was hugely successful, you were going to get a sequel. As sure as you were getting cheap Battalion knockoffs and spin-offs and Indiana Jones ripoffs that were abundant throughout the 1980s and the 1990s because of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Brought back Alan Quartermain, didn't it?
Treasure of the Four Crowns, Raiders of Atlantis, every week there was a new ripoff in the theaters, and some of them played in the theaters. That was the amazing thing. Treasure of the Four Crowns was a theatrical release in North America. And
it does not feature Four Crowns, just so everybody knows.
No, it does not. It is the most flagrant misadvertising of a story since the Never-Ending Story.
All right, so we both are really digging this cover. As I mentioned earlier in the cover description, it's Howard Chaykin inked by Terry Austin, and I think they make a really neat combo, because when I looked at it, I thought this is just a really good-looking image. For a minute there, I thought it might have been a Byrne, but that is because it is the Austin influence that I'm seeing, because, Austin inked Byrne on like everything. So, yeah, I just think artistically it's great, and I love it for all the same reasons you do. It's so Indiana Jones. It's so very Indiana Jones.
And it's very pulpy. Like, if you think back to the old Argosy days, not that you and I were around for that, but again, growing up in the 80s, you saw the influences kind of come back. There were republications and printings of old Argosies, and you could kind of see this being of that tradition of the Dark Continent or the mysterious East that was just a big cultural landmark in the 1930s, that you could kind of see this fitting in that tradition of peril.
Absolutely. Well, once we open up the cover, we get into the story proper, and Brad had the unenviable but also enviable task of picking up of a part 2 of a storyline, but it is 2 of 2. So Brad did not get the setup, but he's read it. But he did get the payoff issue. So we'll get into Africa Screams by David Michelinie, and we'll go to Brad. Just what are your thoughts? Highs, lows, let's see what you thought about this story.
Well, it's Indiana Jones. If you're a fan of Raiders era Indy, this one I don't think you'd have any trouble getting into, even if you just sort of jump in mid-continuity. Indiana Jones is always kind of the James Bond thing, the structure. They kind of aped each other, or in case Indy kind of followed the Bond structure, where with Raiders you very much pick up in the middle of the adventure as he's venturing to the temple in Peru. In this one, they do a very good job. It's kind of funny when you think about it, but they do a really good job of sort of recapping what's going on as Indy and Marion are fleeing. Look like a panther, and then the Nazis about to be shot at by arrows. They're kind of running through the woods, and Indy's saying, "Look, we're not looking for Atlantis, Marion. We're looking for relics of the Shintai, a group, blah 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 blah." And they do a very good job of catching you up, so you don't necessarily need to know what happened in the previous issue. But I think what I really like about this in particular is it's the further adventures, and it's a post-Raiders continuity. And it goes pretty linear from the conclusion of Raiders, I think, in this one and the previous ones. In advance of reading this issue and appearing on your podcast, I did dig them all out and started reading from the very beginning. So I'm all caught up.
We got you.
I'm all caught up on where he is and why he is. And I just think that the Indy formula really lends itself well to comics, which, it's that very fast-paced storytelling. It can plunge you into that serialized adventure. This one just does a really good job of giving you that Indiana Jones feel. It doesn't stop, and it's not ponderous and draggy. It moves from the get-go, and you just kind of have to run along with the characters to keep up, because from the opening jungle pursuit to the capture by this mysterious tribe to all the supernatural daring do and the torture and the executions and everything like that, it just feels very much like they nailed that pulpy kind of vibe, which I would assume in the early 1980s was not that hard to come by, because these writers and artists grew up probably in the 50s and 60s, and if not even earlier. So they were already kind of versed in this kind of storytelling. They probably went to their local town theater afternoon matinees where they'd get a couple of old Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers serials thrown in with the cartoon and the main feature and the backup feature. So I think they kind of grew up with the formula, which made it very easy to adapt, in the same way that the Marvel Star Wars comics, a lot of the old school talent on those initial issues were guys who had started drawing comics in the 40s and the 50s. So it was very much in their wheelhouse. I just think that, again, jumping into a part 2 isn't as disorienting as you'd think, because it is this Saturday serial matinee type of stuff. And I think they just really nailed the whole recap on the fly aspect of it. And the chapters and cliffhangers really do lend to this comic book format. That's the other thing about this issue in this book is, outside of the movies, I think comics really do justice to the Indiana Jones character and premise, because each issue you can either end with a cliffhanger and have to wait for a month for the resolution, or you can kind of pick up in the middle of the danger and in the middle of the peril and sort of see how he gets out of it. So there's a nice rhythm to them when you're reading them all in one go. But even if you pick it up on its own and read it, you can kind of follow along, which I think is the big bonus with it. You don't necessarily need to know what happened before to be able to get into the story because you know the character.
Absolutely. Yeah, they really stick nicely to their cliffhanger roots when it comes to this. And like you said, it's probably because the creators know that world very well. Very well. Looking at the story, one thing that I picked up on in the last issue, and he continues in this issue, is the idea that there's this new character named MacGyver, who's like the Scottish rival to Indiana Jones. He's kind of like the Scottish Belloc, if you will.
Sure.
And I think he's interesting because as far as I can remember, I read through all these once and now I'm doing it again for the podcast. So my memory of it isn't super sharp, but I want to say he's about the only lasting character in the comic universe, like recurring. Like we see the Ravenwoods and we see Marcus, and Short Round will even show up at some point in the comics. But everybody in these comics is really, any recurring characters is really from the movies, with this one exception of this guy MacGyver's. Like it was like Michelini's little add to the universe, which I almost wish would show up in a movie somewhere. Did you have a thought on MacGyver at all?
Yeah, again, it's been a while since I've read all of these. I've just been reading chronologically over the last few days or so in preparation of this episode. But at the end, when he pops out and he's alive, and someday he and Indiana Jones are going to meet up again. And I thought to myself, like, does he come back? Is this one of those things that's teased and never pays off? Or does he actually return? So I'm glad he does return, because his return and just these supporting characters who survive past the story, I think add a lot to the book and actually kind of help you overcome some of the lows as well, which we'll get into. But I don't want to spoil it right then and there. But any kind of recurring character is fun, whether it's from the movie or if it's ones that are just created for the comic book. I think those add a real storytelling value to the proceedings and adds a little bit more jeopardy and a little more intrigue than you would get if it was, again, going back to Star Wars, if it was just the main characters. You kind of know they're going to come through it okay. But these other characters, not so much.
Yeah, adding extra characters to add a mystery. Who's going to make it? Who's not? Is always something that you can fall back on. Another thing I kind of liked about this one, and I'm interested in your take, and then we can get any of your final thoughts too, is the Shintai themselves. Anytime you do these are an offshoot of the Atlantis, Atlanteans, if you will. I always think, they're going to make them look like fish people, but they really just went with they were tall. They were 8 feet tall. They were all strapping, But my favorite thing about it was not just the physical choice that they made for them, but they also were like, these aren't the lovable ones. These are the ones that worship death and all this stuff. You're like, man, only Indy can finally find the thing he's looking for, just to find out it sucks. And do you have any thoughts on the Shintai?
Yeah, well, I love the Shintai. I love when they show up, but in particular, I love when they're leading Indy and Marion and the Nazis to their temple. And it's this great moody shot. There's a nice big bloated poisonous moon in the background and these menacing streaks of light and shadow in the sky. And it's a temple. It's got like a tower and it's a giant skull. Going in that, it's not going to be all, sunshine and lollipops inside the skull. There's going to be some grim stuff there. And that's what I love about this comic and Indiana Jones and just this type of storytelling as well. There's no shades of gray. There are good guys and there are bad guys, and you root for the good guys and you boo and hiss the bad guys, and you love seeing them get their comeuppance. And I love seeing all the Nazis get theirs in the temple. And I love the resolutions, the hubris of Colonel Vogel, who I'm not sure, is he or is he not related to the Colonel Vogel from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Because that character, his name in The Last Crusade was Vogel. So I think it's probably just a coincidence, but it's kind of neat to kind of play headcanon there. And I love his comeuppance, shall we say. Spoiler alert, if only for the mechanics of a giant tusk falling, and hitting him with a shunk sound and a gurgle of death for him. And that just sort of seems, again, that's very much a trope of Indiana Jones. The villains are always undone by their hubris, and they're meddling in things they were not meant to meddle. I think even when he was in a couple of issues, I think he was a really formidable villain, that very sort of sneering, mustache twirling type, which you want from these things. I mean, that's the thing with Indiana Jones in any form of media, is it's not really meant to be taken seriously. And the more seriously you take it, or the more seriously it takes itself, the less fun it is.
I agree. And as I promised you and our listening audience, I've sort of gotten to the rhythm of doing this thing where I'll find something in the comic that really will echo later on in the movies. And for me, it was the colonel, the Nazi colonel in this one, who just had to get his hands on one of these crystals that are spaced out throughout the room. And it was too much for him to handle, which is exactly what happened to that gal in Indiana Jones 4. In King of the Crystal Skull, it was the crystal heads around the room, and she thought she could master one, and she couldn't. Yeah. And I was like, there's the echo. I always find an echo.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that in this one, there's crystals and there's skulls. So, that's a fun little echo.
There's skulls. As I mentioned on the last recording, they're looking for some descendant of Atlantis. And as Indy Jones fans know from 80s and 90s, especially the 90s, that was the big rumor, was the next movie's going to be Atlantis. It's going to be Atlantis.
Yeah. And they did a video game too.
Yeah, a computer game, but they never did come through with the film. But anyway, that was my echo that I found in that one. Did you have any final thoughts? And I'm going to interject something real quick. I think Kerry Gamble did a great job. Him and Sam De La Rosa on the art in this book. I thought it was a lot of fun. Very detailed. It was a good looking book. This is a book that's kind of had rotating pencilers, and it feels like everyone's trying to show up the guy before, giving their best efforts, because it looks great to me. And that's my lead into you. If you want to talk anything about the art, any closing thoughts before we get to we're going to talk about an ad, and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah, I think the art across the board on all these has been really, really solid. And I started reading the Raiders of the Lost Ark adaptation on the weekend to kind of set myself up for going ahead into the comic. And just, I've really been enjoying the art and the fact that they all bring something new and something different to it. It's almost like they're enjoying the fact that they got assigned an Indiana Jones book. And they're like, all right, finally, I get to draw skulls and, Carol and all these other things. And I think, for me, the comics of the early 1980s, these are my golden age. People will talk about different eras and say, here's the golden age, here's the silver age. This is the golden age for me. It's just something about the style of art at the time and the way they told stories back then, where there was just a lot of, entertainment packed into each issue. The pages just really kind of turn themselves, I think if there's any one thing I would say that's not really a criticism, but just an observation, we did touch on this a little bit, was that with any licensed property, there's, for all the jeopardy in the book, Indy's going to come out okay. And Marion is also likely going to come out okay. And while you do enjoy seeing the old faves in the comic book, that no lasting harm is really going to come to the licensed characters. But whenever they introduce a new sidekick or damsel or villain, there's a little bit more suspense, because we don't know if they're going to survive, if they're going to pull a heel turn or something like that. So I would say with this one, while the outcome is a foregone conclusion, I like the way it resolved itself with our little baddie escaping and vengeance against Indiana Jones. And I think it's just, it really lends itself to the comic book format, and having these, these little tags, these little stingers, and saying, okay, some of these people are not going to come back, but some of them might. And that keeps you kind of reading. You can kind of see them sort of building, trying to build a reservoir or a backlog of other characters that they can pop in at different points in the story. So it's a lot of fun.
I mentioned on the last episode, and I still am not sure, but I think David Michelinie, who just started a couple issues ago, really gets a solid run of books here, because it was kind of trading creators for a while. And I think that really helps, because he's able to kind of get his own rhythm and continuity. And I'm going to just go back to something you said a couple minutes ago about this being the golden age of comics for you. I agree. Anytime I'm flipping through like a dollar bin, or God bless you, 50 cents bin, or God bless you, a quarter bin. And I see that Marvel Comics Group banner across the top on the cover, I don't even care what book it is. I'm like, I'm buying this. This was the era for me.
And you see that even just when you're going through the issue. And just this issue came out at the same time as, I think, G.I. Joe 13 or 14, which I have read many times. And so even though the story is different, it was just kind of nice to turn through and see things like that subscriber ad with Wolverine slashing prices and everything like that. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember those. I remember the Muscles in 7 Days little ad, and the ad. I just love looking at the little tiny little ads, like the classified ads for local comic book stores that decide to run an ad, and you think to yourself, did this is the store still there? Did it go under?
Speaking of ads, thanks for the segue, Brad. Speaking of ads,
segues, yeah.
Well, this is the part of the show where we pick an ad, and Brad and I talked a little bit before we clicked record, and he decided he wanted to go to inside the back cover, and I'll let you reveal it. It's your ad. You can talk about all you like.
This is an ad for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the cartridge game for the Mattel Electronics Intellivision.
Now what do I do? Okay, this is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons video game cartridge.
You have to buy it separately to play on the Intellivision video game system.
Mom and Dad have to hook it up to the TV. What next? We're trying to find a crown, but it's real easy to get lost. So don't be surprised if the dragon finds you first. Holy cats, you just killed the dragon. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it.
Advanced Dungeons & Dragons video game cartridge and Intellivision master component from Mattel Electronics, each sold separately.
And it says the video game where danger lurks around every bend in your quest for the golden crown. Not the 4 crowns, the golden crown. And it's got a dragon sort of rearing up over like small guy with an archer who's got a puny little arrow he's going to fire at him. He's on a bridge. And it shows the stunning Intellivision graphics in a little window box, which is just, it's like Showdown and Blocktown. Everything's kind of blocky. It's that, I think it was it even 8-bit back then? I don't even remember.
No, the NES was the 8-bit era.
So okay, so this is even
even 2-bit, 4-bit. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, and it makes me think of the old Intellivision commercials back in the early 80s, boys and girls and kids. There was a thing called the Video Game Wars and the Console Wars, and it was always between Atari and Intellivision. And Atari had more games, less expensive, and it kind of showed in the games because the games, frankly, were not so great. And in Intellivision, I think it was George Plimpton, the very urbane George Plimpton, who was championing Intellivision's superior graphics. And I mean, compared to Atari, yes, they were superior graphics. That's where the comparison ended, because on their own, it was still the same thing. It was slightly better. The graphics were slightly better. I remember the controls. A friend of mine had in Intellivision. The controls, there wasn't even a joystick. It was this little spinny little disc you kind of had to press on to get the guy to move and everything like that. And for many reasons, the home video console market kind of collapsed at the same time the arcade market did as well back in the 80s. But there's something about a Dungeons and Dragons ad in a comic book of the era. The 80s were a very big deal for role-playing D&D. There was a mild satanic panic over it. There was a great little TV movie with Tom Hanks called Mazes and Monsters. You can catch it on YouTube. It's about a young man who goes way too deep into Dungeons and Dragons role-playing and ends with a climax atop one of the World Trade Center towers. So that's kind of a trip. And there was a really great Saturday morning D&D cartoon I remember watching. I never really played the game, though. I did have a gaming module and a guidebook, but I found I just enjoyed reading it. You know, reading about the wraiths and the gelatinous cubes and the keeps on the borderlands and all those things, and just imagining these scenarios without the trouble of organizing a game and having friends over. Honestly, it was one of the things that really kind of helped me with my writing later on, crafting characters, good and bad, with strengths and weaknesses. I would pull the weathered D&D guide off the shelf and look at the character design sheets and go, okay, he's a laconic scout and he's got a fear of rats, and just using those things. So, I mean, it was I think the reason the game was so popular was just that imagination. You can kind of create your own character and imbue them with personalities. So I just like the ad. I just loved seeing it. I like seeing the Intellivision ad, just like I like seeing all the video game ads. The back cover is Frogger, which I had to decide between the two of them. I had to go with Dungeons and Dragons because it just screams 80s, and it just reminds me so much of this early 80s era of this comic. And just culture in general, you know? Absolutely.
The great thing about this era of the Atari and the Intellivision is, as we said, the graphics, you had to use your imagination a lot back then, whether you were playing actual D&D or video game D&D.
Yeah.
So they put a lot of effort into the art around the game. And the art on this ad is spectacular.
Yes. There was a book, I can't remember the name, I think it's called The Art of Atari. You can find it online, relatively inexpensive. It's available on some digital formats. And it's just looking at all the artwork for the Atari cartridge games. And the artwork on those things was always fantastic because the games looked so terrible. Like Missile Command you look at the box of Missile Command and you think, I want to play that game. And then you play Missile Command and you're like, I want to play the game that's on the box. I don't know. What is this? Pixels and blobs and things like that. But, this is old guy me talking. But I think that there was a definite quality to video games and just media back then where, the technology wasn't so great. The effects weren't so great. The mechanics of making them weren't as high tech as they are now, but you had to use your imagination to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit more and kind of stretch those creative muscles a little bit. And rather than having everything, you walk down this path and you push this thing aside and you just kind of had to find your own way, which I think is what made them a lot of fun.
I wholeheartedly agree as a long-time gamer myself. Well, that about wraps it up for the further adventures of Indiana Jones number 8. We have covered a lot of ground and a really fun issue, and I thank Brad for being here. And we're not going to let Brad get away without telling us where he can be found on the internet. Brad, thanks again for being here, making your way through the traps to get to the Temple of Longbox. Hopefully you can remember how to do those in reverse to get back out.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. And it's like, which little tiles do I step on to not get darted? Do I
have you spelled Jehovah backwards in Latin?
Yes, in Latin. Yeah. How did they get back from that? I'm trying to remember. You can find out about me at my website, bradabraham.com. It's where I do most of my scribbling. I do a lot of writing just about movies and culture and reminiscence. I already kind of announced it when I recorded the most recent episode at the Headcast, but I'm starting my own podcast in January. It is called Celluloid Heroes, and it is a Gen X journey through 50 years of American and international cinema. It's based on a web series, not a video web series, a written web series that I've been running on my website the last several years, where I'll spotlight a movie that I saw in the theater for the first time and kind of examine it from a cultural standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, what it meant to see it, what its impact is. Anyway, that'll go on, I think, in January. I'll pass more information on to the world at large. That may mean getting back onto social media, where my handle is not Brad Abraham, and it is still out there. I just have not been using it a lot, but I'm going to have to. So that's where you'll find me.
All right. That's very cool. And I'm way ahead on these recordings. This probably will come out after your debut in January. Mm-hmm. So if you listen to this and you didn't know that Brad had that going on, check that out. I'm sure he'll have information on it at bradabraham.com.
Oh, yeah.
You'll be able to find out what you need there. I'm a little salty about it because about 2 months ago, I made a list of the 25, I think it was 20 or 25 movies that I saw on the big screen in high school that I thought were important, and I was going to do a podcast around it. And now it seems like I stole the idea. But anyway. But anyways, we wish you luck with that, Brad. And thank you again for joining us here in the Temple Longbox.
Thanks for having me.
You can find me at Yard Sale Artist on X, Facebook, and Instagram. It's all at Yard Sale Artist. You can check out my artwares at www.theyardsaleartist.com. And of course, we'd love for you to check out the Longbox Crusade in all its locations. We are at Longbox Crusade on X, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. You name it, you can probably find us out there at Longbox Crusade. Of course, you can call and leave a voicemail, 707-532-5269, 707-532-LBOX. We'd love to hear from you. And this is one of our shorter shows, so I will just say thank you to all the Patreon members out there. Our Crusaders Club members are the best, and they keep this stuff going. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading your names on a longer episode in the near future. With that, thanks for joining us again down here in the Temple of Longbox, and we will see you soon.
We named the dog Indiana. The dog? You are named after the dog?
Got a lot of fond memories of that dog.
What did you find, Junior?
Junior? Dad?
Jeez, what does it always mean? It's Junior. What's his name? Henry Jones Jr.
Like Indiana.
May we go home now, please?